Kamala Harris stood at the center of the Senate chamber, her gaze unwavering, her posture poised but powerful. The weight of the room pressed down on her, every eye was fixed on her, waiting, anticipating. Across the floor, Mitch McConnell sat, his usual smirk barely concealing the arrogance in his eyes. He had dominated the Senate for decades, steering policies with an iron grip, his influence stretching to every corner of the chamber. But today, in this very moment, everything was about to change. The air was thick with tension. The ongoing debate on McConnell's controversial policy had reached its peak. Senators murmured in disbelief, their pens poised mid-sentence, unsure whether they should speak or hold their breath. Harris had watched the back and forth for hours, the manipulations, the distortions, the sheer arrogance with which McConnell dismissed every concern, every plea for justice. But now, she'd had enough. It was time to make her move. She stood, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. The camera zoomed in on her, the silence almost deafening as she rose. "Senator McConnell," Harris began, her voice steady and firm, "I challenge the very foundation of your policy. And I have the legal grounds to shut it down." Gasps echoed through the room. McConnell's eyes narrowed. For the first time that day, he looked uncertain. The tension surged as Harris's words hung in the air. Every senator, every staff member, every viewer at home felt the weight of what had just been said. The room fell into an uneasy silence. No one had dared to challenge McConnell like this, not openly, not so boldly. McConnell's lips twisted into a tight smile, the kind that said he was amused, that he believed this was a minor interruption in the grand theater of politics. But beneath that smile, something flickered, perhaps fear, perhaps doubt. It was hard to tell. But what would happen next would leave everyone in the room, and across the nation, in shock. For months, Mitch McConnell had pushed his controversial policy forward with the same relentless determination that had made him the longest-serving Senate Majority Leader in history. A policy cloaked in the language of fiscal responsibility and national security, it promised to overhaul the nation's immigration system, limit social safety nets, and slash funding for public education and healthcare. On the surface, it appeared to be a carefully crafted solution to the country's rising debt and fractured economy. But beneath the rhetoric, it was something far more dangerous. To the disenfranchised, the policy was an outright attack, on immigrants, on the working class, on the very fabric of what America stood for. Critics called it a direct assault on the most vulnerable, children, the elderly, and immigrants who had spent years contributing to the nation. They said it would create a fractured society, one where the rich got richer and the rest of the country was left to fend for itself. Harris had been vocal in her criticism of McConnell's legislative agenda from the start, but until now, she had been careful. She had played her cards strategically, ensuring that every step she took was calculated, measured. She knew that McConnell was a master manipulator, and anything she did would be met with fierce retaliation. But as the policy reached its final stages in the Senate, Harris couldn't stay silent any longer. This wasn't just a political maneuver. This was bigger. The policy represented a profound shift in America's values, a shift away from inclusivity and equality, toward division and exclusion. It was a choice to disregard the struggles of millions of families who had built their lives in this country, worked tirelessly to contribute to its prosperity, and yet remained invisible in the eyes of the powerful. For Harris, this was no longer about partisanship. It was about justice, about defending the very soul of the nation. Harris had seen firsthand the pain that McConnell's policies would cause. As a former prosecutor, she had fought to protect the rights of immigrants, minorities, and the underserved communities. She knew the stakes were higher than anyone realized. If McConnell's policy passed, it wouldn't just be a setback for marginalized communities, it would be a permanent scar on the nation's conscience, a victory for those who sought to divide, to exploit, to perpetuate inequality. But Harris wasn't just standing against McConnell. She was standing against a system that had allowed people like him to thrive unchecked for decades, a system that had ignored the cries for justice, equality, and opportunity. She had seen what the status quo had done to too many lives, the endless cycles of poverty, the lack of access to quality education and healthcare, the discrimination that stunted potential at every turn. Her challenge was not just a moment in time. It was the culmination of years of struggle. It was a call to action, a demand for a new path forward. She couldn't let this moment slip by. The world was watching. The country was waiting. McConnell's response would set the tone for the entire debate. He had dismissed the cries of the marginalized for too long. But Harris wasn't here to just talk. She was here to act. And what happened next, no one could have predicted. Mitch McConnell had spent more than 3 decades in the Senate, amassing power with a tenacity that few could match. He was a master of the game, a strategist who understood every angle, every lever of influence, every backroom deal. He wasn't just a politician, he was the architect of a machine that had driven the direction of American policy for years. He knew how to win. And winning, to McConnell, wasn't just about passing laws, it was about shaping the nation in his image. Born in 1942 in Alabama, McConnell had always been a student of power. Raised in a world where influence was wielded like a weapon, he quickly learned that compromise wasn't always the answer. He knew that, in order to control the Senate, he would have to bend the rules, play to his party's strengths, and, when necessary, bulldoze over anyone who stood in his way. He wasn't afraid to be ruthless, and it worked, time and time again. In the 1980s, McConnell made his mark by serving as the leader of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, helping his party secure a steady stream of victories across the country. But it was in the early 2000s, when the Republicans regained control of the Senate, that McConnell truly began to carve out his legacy. He took the position of minority leader in 2007 and later became the majority leader in 2015. But while many saw him as the tortoise of Senate politics, slow, steady, and calculated, he was anything but patient. McConnell didn't just wait for victories to come, he engineered them. He mastered the art of obstruction, using the Senate filibuster to block any piece of legislation that didn't align with his conservative values. In 2009, he declared, "The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president," setting the stage for years of partisan gridlock. It was his playbook: block anything from the left, push through anything from the right, and make sure that no matter what, the narrative was shaped by his party's interests. His refusal to allow a Supreme Court nominee under Obama's presidency became a textbook example of how far he would go to protect his side's power, even if it meant bending, or breaking, conventions. But McConnell's power wasn't just built on strategy. It was built on his ability to manipulate the system, to turn every political debate into a contest of wills. Whether it was the tax cuts of 2017, aimed at corporations and the wealthiest Americans, or his blocking of critical voting rights protections, McConnell's decisions had one thing in common: they always served the interests of the wealthy elite and the status quo. His policies were frequently praised by his party, but the consequences were far from hidden. He had overseen the dismantling of labor rights, the erosion of environmental protections, and the stacking of the judiciary with conservative ideologues, all while claiming that he was simply protecting the country from radical leftist ideologies. His rhetoric was wrapped in the language of patriotism, of tradition, but his policies often betrayed the very people he claimed to protect. And yet, despite the growing public dissatisfaction, McConnell's confidence never wavered. He saw himself as a protector of the conservative ideals that had shaped America for generations. He didn't just view the Senate as a legislative body; to him, it was a fortress, his fortress, and anyone who tried to breach it would have to contend with him. By the time Harris stood up to him in the Senate, McConnell believed himself to be untouchable. His most recent policy push, the one that had ignited the current debate, was a perfect example of his political style: sweeping, aggressive, and, most importantly, self-serving. It was framed as a necessary reform to fix the nation's broken immigration system, an issue he had long used as a political tool to energize his base. But in reality, the policy was designed to limit access to public services, cut funding to immigrant communities, and solidify his control over the conservative narrative in the country. For McConnell, the policy wasn't just about solving an issue, it was about keeping the immigrant population in check and reinforcing the system that had allowed him to remain in power for so long. But the very arrogance that had allowed McConnell to rise to the top of American politics had begun to work against him. His disregard for the voices of marginalized communities, his relentless push to dismantle the very institutions that supported the most vulnerable, and his refusal to acknowledge the changing tides of American demographics had left him exposed. Kamala Harris understood this better than anyone. She had watched McConnell's policies tear through communities like a bulldozer, leaving destruction in its wake. She had seen firsthand how his decisions had hurt real people, from immigrant families to the working class. And now, as she faced him across the Senate floor, she understood the stakes more clearly than ever. If McConnell's vision for America continued unchecked, it would leave a legacy of inequality and division for generations to come. For all his power, for all his manipulation, McConnell had made one critical misstep. He had underestimated Harris, and worse, he had underestimated the moral force that would rise against him. Harris had studied McConnell's every move, and now, it was time to dismantle his vision, piece by piece. But McConnell, ever confident, didn't believe that anyone, least of all Kamala Harris, could stop him. Kamala Harris's rise to political prominence wasn't a story of privilege or smooth ascension. It was forged in the fire of injustice, in the face of adversity, and on the backs of countless people whose struggles she'd witnessed firsthand. From the very beginning, her path was a testament to perseverance, to the understanding that the law could be a powerful tool, not just for the powerful, but for those who had been left behind. Born in 1964 in Oakland, California, Kamala was the daughter of immigrants, her mother, Shyamala, a biologist from India, and her father, Donald, a Jamaican economist. They met during their college years, two immigrants coming together in the heart of America's political awakening. They had dreams for their daughter, dreams rooted in a belief that America could be better, that it could be a land of opportunity for those who worked hard enough, no matter where they came from. But Kamala's childhood wasn't just defined by love and hope. It was also shaped by the sting of inequality. Growing up in the racially charged atmosphere of 1970s California, Kamala saw firsthand how prejudice and systemic bias affected those around her. She was raised in a country where people of color were told to be grateful for any opportunity, where being anything other than white often meant being overlooked or denied. But her mother, strong-willed and fiercely independent, would not let that reality define her children. She taught Kamala the value of hard work, of education, and of standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. At a young age, Kamala understood the meaning of struggle, of fighting not just for your own future, but for the future of those who couldn't fight for themselves. Her experiences, both at home and in the world around her, ignited a passion for justice, a desire to ensure that the scales of law weren't tilted in favor of those with wealth, influence, or power. Her decision to enter law school wasn't just about personal ambition, it was about making a difference. She wanted to be in the fight, standing up for people who had been silenced, for communities that had been overlooked, and for the marginalized that had long been ignored by those in power. She went to Howard University, one of the most prestigious historically black colleges in the country, where she found a community that shared her desire to change the system. But even at Howard, she knew that a degree alone wouldn't be enough, there would be hard, bitter battles ahead. After graduating from law school at the University of California, Hastings, Kamala entered public service. She first worked as a prosecutor in Alameda County, where she took on the tough cases, the ones that didn't get the headlines but affected the lives of real people. She wasn't interested in the easy wins or the high-profile cases. She wanted to give voice to the voiceless, to hold those accountable who thought they could escape justice simply because they were rich, connected, or powerful. Her early career wasn't without sacrifice. She worked long hours, often at the expense of her personal life. The cases she worked on were draining, and the injustices she encountered were infuriating. But it was through this work that Kamala developed the legal expertise that would become the cornerstone of her career. She learned how to navigate the complexities of the law, how to fight for what was right even when it seemed like the system was rigged against you. And through every battle, she became more and more determined to use the law as a shield for the oppressed and as a weapon against those who abused their power. Her political career was not a quick or easy climb. In 2003, she ran for district attorney of San Francisco. Her opponents were well-established political figures, many of whom had the connections, the name recognition, and the political backing to dominate the race. But Kamala had something that they didn't, an unshakable commitment to reform and an unrelenting belief that the system could be made better. She won the race, becoming the first woman, the first black woman, and the first South Asian woman to hold the position of district attorney in San Francisco. As DA, Kamala pushed for bold reforms. She didn't just seek convictions, she sought justice. She focused on programs aimed at reducing recidivism, on creating alternative sentencing options for nonviolent offenders, and on addressing the root causes of crime. She understood that the law wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation, about giving people a second chance. But it wasn't just her role as a prosecutor or DA that brought Kamala into the political spotlight. It was her unflinching commitment to the people that propelled her forward. In 2010, she became California's Attorney General, the first woman of color to hold the office. It was here that she truly began to shape her legacy as a champion of justice. She took on the big fights, standing up to the banks during the housing crisis, fighting for immigrant rights, and challenging the corruption that had plagued the state for decades. She was not afraid to stand alone, to challenge the establishment, to face down powerful corporate interests when they violated the rights of everyday Californians. Her move to the Senate in 2016 was the natural progression of a career rooted in service and advocacy. But even then, as she entered the halls of the Senate, she never forgot why she was there. Kamala wasn't in politics to play it safe. She wasn't interested in appeasing the establishment or playing the game to climb the ranks. She was there to disrupt, to challenge, and to make sure that the voices of the powerless were finally heard. Her work in the Senate only solidified her reputation as a force to be reckoned with. She fearlessly stood up to corporate interests, championed progressive policies, and became one of the most vocal advocates for racial and economic justice. When the stakes were high, when the political establishment was comfortable, Kamala Harris was never afraid to shake the system to its core. It was this commitment to justice that brought her to the Senate floor that fateful day, standing before Mitch McConnell. This wasn't just another political battle, it was the culmination of a lifetime of fighting for what was right. Harris knew that her challenge to McConnell wasn't just about a policy. It was about sending a message to the nation that the fight for justice would never be silenced. That standing up for the people, for the marginalized, for those who had no voice, was always worth the fight. And no matter how powerful McConnell was, she would never back down. McConnell's sneer deepened as Harris's challenge echoed through the Senate chamber. The room was charged with tension, as if everyone could feel the seismic shift happening in real time. McConnell, the ever-confident Senate Majority Leader, had spent decades controlling the narrative with subtlety and force. But now, a direct assault had been launched against his carefully crafted policy, and for the first time, he was on the defensive. He straightened up in his chair, looking down his nose at Harris. "Senator Harris," he said with a hint of mockery, "I don't believe you fully grasp the complexities of this policy. It's not just about ideology, it's about the reality of what we can afford. I understand that you're new to this level of debate, but you should be careful not to rush to conclusions." The room held its breath. The smugness in McConnell's voice was unmistakable, as though he had already won the argument by default. He leaned back, folding his arms with the air of someone who had just delivered a masterstroke of logic that would silence any opposition. But Harris wasn't rattled. Her face remained calm, the corners of her mouth barely moving, her eyes sharp and focused. She had been here before. She had faced down bullies, corrupt power brokers, and systems designed to crush dissent. She wasn't here to play games. And she wasn't going to back down. "Actually, Senator McConnell," Harris began, her voice firm and controlled, "I understand the policy quite well. And that's precisely why I challenge it." She paused for a moment, letting her words settle before continuing. "This policy isn't about economic necessity. It's about consolidating power and excluding those who have made this country what it is. I don't need to be here for decades to know that this is wrong. The silence in the room was deafening, and McConnell's face tightened. The dismissive air that had dominated him only moments earlier now seemed to evaporate. He opened his mouth to speak, but Harris was already ahead of him. You see, Senator, it's not that I don't understand the details of your proposal. I do. The real issue here is what you're willing to sacrifice for the sake of your agenda. Her tone remained calm, but there was an edge to it, a calculated sharpness that cut through McConnell's bravado. You're willing to sacrifice the most vulnerable among us, the working families, the immigrants who've worked for this country, all in the name of cutting costs and consolidating power. And that's where you've lost the plot. McConnell's mouth opened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, trying to match Harris's intensity. You're oversimplifying things, Senator, he said, his voice growing a bit louder, more defensive. This is about the survival of our nation, the financial future of the American people. It's about reducing the deficit. And you, he gestured sharply at Harris, you, Senator Harris, want to ignore the realities we're facing. You want to push a radical, dangerous agenda that will plunge us even further into debt. You can't simply legislate your way out of a crisis. His words were sharper now, more clipped, and his voice wavered just enough to betray a sense of desperation. The calm that had marked his earlier remarks had started to crack. He had expected Harris to fold under pressure, to be intimidated into backpedaling. But she didn't budge. I'm not ignoring reality, Senator McConnell, Harris responded, her voice a cool counterpoint to his growing aggression. I'm facing it head-on. The reality is, your policy leaves millions behind. It places an unbearable burden on the most marginalized and offers no real solutions for the future. Cutting vital programs for immigrants and the working poor will only deepen the very problems you claim to be solving. Her words were precise, surgical, like a legal argument unfolding before a judge. The audience could feel the power of her conviction, and it was clear that McConnell knew he was losing control. His face reddened, his fingers tightened around the edge of his podium, as if the weight of her challenge was physically pressing on him. Your policies have always favored the wealthy, Harris continued, unfazed by McConnell's attempts to reassert dominance. And you've managed to spin this as fiscal conservatism. But here's the truth, Senator, it's about power. You're using this policy to further entrench the status quo, to keep the same elites at the top while pushing everyone else to the margins. Don't pretend this is about anything else. McConnell's expression twisted, and for a moment, the cool, calculating politician seemed to unravel. His usual posture, that of the immovable leader, now seemed strained, like he was struggling to hold on to his last semblance of control. I will not sit here and listen to you accuse me of, McConnell began, but Harris cut him off, her tone firm. Senator, you have no right to lecture me about fiscal responsibility, especially when your policies are designed to pad the pockets of those who need it the least. It's your policies that are bankrupting this nation, not the people you want to scapegoat. McConnell's face twisted into a scowl, his voice rising in pitch. You can't just throw around accusations like that. But Harris was in full command now, and McConnell's deflections were no match for her. This is about more than policy, Senator, she said, her voice calm yet undeniably powerful. It's about the future of this country, and what kind of nation we want to be. A nation that gives power to the few at the expense of the many? Or one that stands for justice, equality, and opportunity for all? McConnell stammered for a response, but Harris's words had already landed. The room was silent again, the weight of her challenge hanging in the air, as the tide slowly turned in her favor. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it was clear that McConnell's confidence was slipping. And the stakes had just gotten higher. Kamala Harris paused for a moment, allowing the silence in the chamber to stretch out, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. McConnell, visibly rattled, leaned forward in his chair, trying to regain the upper hand, but Harris was already in full control. She was calm, deliberate, methodical in her approach, but there was a sharpness to her words that cut through the tension like a blade. Senator McConnell, she began, her voice steady, yet carrying the weight of a courtroom verdict, "I'm not here for politics. I'm here for justice. And I'm here to remind you that the Constitution is the highest law of the land. And that," she paused for effect, allowing the tension to build, "is where your policy falls apart." McConnell's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to retort, but Harris was already several steps ahead. She pressed on, knowing this was her moment to strike. The room was hanging on every word. "Let's talk about the Constitution," Harris continued, her tone sharp. "You see, Senator, Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the authority to regulate immigration. But nowhere in that section does it say we can strip away the rights of individuals based on their nationality or legal status. Your policy is not about legal oversight, it's a direct violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment." A ripple of whispers spread across the room. McConnell's face shifted, a flicker of concern in his eyes, though he tried to mask it with a defensive sneer. Harris took another step forward, her voice unwavering. "The 14th Amendment, Senator, guarantees equal protection under the law to all persons, regardless of their citizenship status. Your policy seeks to discriminate against those who have lived, worked, and contributed to this country. This isn't just a policy disagreement, Senator, it's a violation of constitutional rights." She paused again, letting the words settle in. McConnell's lips pressed together tightly as if trying to force his retort, but nothing came. "You claim this is about fiscal responsibility, about cutting costs and balancing the budget," Harris continued, picking up the pace. "But I'll remind you of a simple fact, your policy targets the vulnerable, the immigrants who work in our fields, build our infrastructure, care for our families. These people aren't a burden, they're the backbone of our economy. And if we're talking about fiscal responsibility, let's talk about the costs of turning our backs on them." She stepped closer to the podium, her presence commanding attention. "You want to save money by cutting public services for the poor and working class, but your tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans cost the country trillions. Let's be clear, this isn't about fiscal conservatism, Senator. It's about reinforcing a system that benefits the rich and punishes the poor. And that's where your policy fails. It's built on the idea that some lives matter more than others." McConnell's expression flickered, and for the first time, he looked less certain of himself. The confident, domineering figure was beginning to show cracks. Harris wasn't just refuting his arguments, she was shattering the very foundation of his claims. "You're relying on scare tactics, Senator," she said, her voice cutting through the growing murmur of the chamber. "You've sold your policy to the American people as a necessary step to protect jobs, to protect our borders. But let's talk about the reality of your plan. Your proposal would strip healthcare from millions, would send families into further poverty, and would punish workers for the simple crime of being immigrants in this country." Harris paused, scanning the room, letting the enormity of her words sink in. She could see the ripple of doubt spreading through the chamber, hear the whispers, the subtle shifts in the way her opponents were looking at McConnell now. The facade was crumbling. "And while you claim that this policy is about fairness," Harris continued, her voice now cutting through the room like a knife, "let's not forget the words of the Supreme Court in United States v. Windsor, when they ruled that the rights of individuals cannot be violated by the government's overreach. You're asking us to disregard decades of legal precedent, to undermine the very principles this country was founded on, all in the name of political convenience." McConnell's hand gripped the edge of his podium, his knuckles white. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. His earlier confidence was slipping. The room had gone from watching a typical debate to witnessing something more, something far more pivotal. "Senator," Harris said, her voice softer now, but no less commanding, "you know as well as I do that the courts will strike down this policy the moment it is challenged. And when that happens, it won't just be a legal defeat. It will be a moral one. This country will not stand for laws that are unjust, that discriminate against our neighbors, against our families." Harris's words landed with precision, each fact, each legal precedent, hitting McConnell with the force of a sledgehammer. His face had drained of color, his earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. She wasn't just fighting policy, she was dismantling McConnell's entire strategy, exposing the cracks in his carefully constructed narrative. The room was quiet now. The senators around them watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between McConnell and Harris. The usual rhythm of debate, the back and forth, the insults, the theater, had all but disappeared. This was no longer just a policy discussion, this was a battle for the soul of the nation, and Harris was winning. "Let me be clear," Harris said, her voice now a steady, powerful force. "This is about more than a policy, it's about our values. It's about whether we believe in a nation that stands for justice, for equality, for the rights of every person, or if we choose to turn our backs on those who need us most. I choose justice, Senator. I choose equality. And I choose a country where every person has the right to live with dignity." There was no more deflection from McConnell, no more dismissive remarks or attempts to undermine Harris's position. He simply sat there, staring ahead, his face betraying a sense of defeat that he couldn't mask any longer. His policy, his entire argument, had been dismantled in a matter of moments. The audience, both in the chamber and across the country, had witnessed something rare, a powerful political figure being brought to his knees by the law, by the Constitution, and by the force of truth. Harris didn't wait for applause. She didn't need to. The victory had already been won, and the stakes had already been set. The real battle was just beginning. The moment Harris made her mic drop counterattack, the Senate chamber was plunged into a stunned silence. The words that had just unraveled McConnell's entire argument rippled outward, far beyond the polished marble walls of the Capitol. As the debate came to an abrupt halt, the consequences were already unfolding, not just within the halls of Congress, but across the nation, in real time. By the time the Senate session adjourned, the news cycle was already buzzing. Headlines screamed across TV screens and social media feeds. News outlets quickly turned to analysis, dissecting every word Harris had spoken. Her legal acumen, her calm demeanor, and her precise dismantling of McConnell's argument were the subject of praise from every corner of the media landscape. On MSNBC, analysts were visibly stunned. In a single moment, Kamala Harris proved that she's more than just a senator, she's a force to be reckoned with, one commentator said, his voice cracking with admiration. But the real frenzy began on social media. By the evening, the hashtag #LegalBossKamala was trending nationwide. Twitter was flooded with tweets from all sides of the political spectrum, but the overwhelming sentiment was clear: Harris had won. Memes flooded the internet within minutes, some featuring her cool, poised face next to bold captions like, "When you bring a law book to a knife fight," and "Kamala Harris won, Mitch McConnell 0." The memes were biting, sharp, and filled with the unmistakable energy of a cultural moment. For many, Harris had not only defeated McConnell, she had stood up for justice, for immigrants, and for the heart of what America stood for. On Instagram, influencers and activists were posting videos of themselves celebrating Harris's legal takedown, rallying their followers to use the hashtag. "This is why we vote," one popular activist posted, tagging the video with hashtag #JusticePrevails. In the heart of the most progressive communities, people felt empowered, like something bigger than just a Senate debate had shifted in their favor. The effects were felt even on conservative media outlets. Fox News, always quick to defend McConnell and other Republican leaders, tried to spin the narrative, but their efforts were frazzled. The network invited a series of commentators to discuss the debate, but no matter how hard they tried to frame Harris's response as a political stunt, the mood in the studio betrayed them. One pundit even went so far as to call her dangerously ambitious, but it was clear that their spin wasn't sticking. The hashtag #KamalaGotM was everywhere, as even conservative-leaning commentators found themselves acknowledging Harris's sharp legal mind. Even McConnell's team, usually so calculated and controlled, was scrambling. Internal memos leaked later that night showed the extent of the panic. They had been blindsided. There were discussions of rebranding the policy, of modifying certain provisions, of doing anything to avoid the legal challenge Harris had foreshadowed. But the damage was done. The policy, which had once seemed like a sure thing, was now under an unrelenting microscope. Media outlets began to pick apart the flaws in McConnell's arguments, drawing attention to the legal precedents Harris had referenced and the glaring constitutional violations of his proposals. The political landscape had shifted. The once unassailable McConnell was now facing a barrage of scrutiny. While he had been able to push his policies through for years, his credibility had been severely damaged. His team's attempts to rally support were met with resistance from both Democrats and Republicans, as they realized that aligning with a man who had just been decisively outclassed on the Senate floor would cost them politically. On social media, McConnell's face was turned into a symbol of frustration, his attempts to defend himself becoming the subject of sarcastic gifs and viral posts mocking his inability to recover from Harris's attack. Even President Biden, who had largely stayed out of the debate, felt the pressure to weigh in. A tweet from the official White House account read, "Kamala Harris's response today was a shining example of what it means to defend the Constitution. She showed us all that leadership is not about power, it's about principle." The cultural ripple effect was undeniable. In the days that followed, there was a renewed surge in grassroots activism. Progressive organizations saw a spike in donations and volunteer sign-ups. Harris's supporters felt as though they had just witnessed a rare moment of true justice in the American political system, a moment where power, arrogance, and money were held in check by the law and by someone who stood up for what was right. Kamala Harris's legal response wasn't just a victory for Democrats or for progressives, one political analyst on CNN remarked the next day. It was a victory for anyone who believes that the law is a tool for justice, and not a weapon for the powerful. As the weekend drew to a close, Harris had become more than just a senator from California, she had become a symbol. The conversation wasn't just about the policies she had defeated, it was about the future of the American political system. Her success was a powerful reminder that the law could be wielded not just by the elite, but by those who truly cared about the greater good. The impact on McConnell, on the other hand, was harder to gauge. For years, he had been the master of Senate procedure, the puppet master behind much of the country's legislative machinery. But now, his policy agenda had been irrevocably changed. His legacy was tarnished, his political capital depleted. The weeks that followed would see him in damage control mode, trying to rally support, but it was clear that the narrative had already shifted. McConnell's influence, which had once seemed all-powerful, was now in jeopardy. The public perception of him, once untouchable, was now marked by one undeniable truth: he had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and ultimately defeated by Kamala Harris. And for those who had long fought for justice and equity, Harris's victory felt like a watershed moment, a moment where the voice of reason, grounded in law and justice, had shattered the status quo. The ripple effect of her legal brilliance would reverberate through the political world for years to come. The debate had ended. The tension that had gripped the Senate chamber, the moment of confrontation that had been so palpable, now seemed distant. The room had fallen silent in the aftermath of Kamala Harris's legal counterattack. McConnell, once brimming with certainty, sat in stunned silence, his carefully constructed policy unraveling before him. But Harris, unflinching, stood tall, her victory not just in the argument, but in the very principles she had defended. As the Senate adjourned and the cameras clicked off, Harris walked out of the chamber, her head held high. The weight of the moment had not been lost on her, she knew this fight was bigger than just one policy, bigger than even McConnell. This was a battle for the soul of the nation, for the belief that justice and the rule of law should guide every decision, not power, not privilege. In her statement to the press later that evening, Harris didn't focus on her personal triumph. Instead, she reframed the entire debate, elevating it to something more universal, something that would resonate far beyond the confines of Washington. "The events of today were not about me," Harris said, her voice steady and resolute. "They were about what this country stands for. What we, as a people, stand for. What we choose to believe in, and who we choose to be." She paused, letting her words sink in. The reporters, eager to catch every syllable, hung on her every word. But it wasn't just the reporters. It was the people watching at home, the families gathered around dinner tables, the activists planning their next steps, the citizens who had for too long felt unheard. This was their moment, too. The law is not a weapon for the powerful to wield against the vulnerable, Harris continued, her voice gaining strength. It is a shield for the people. It is a promise that no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, you deserve to be treated with dignity. You deserve justice. The law exists to protect those who have no voice. It is not meant to silence them. Her words echoed through the airwaves, resonating with the millions who had been following her every move. It wasn't just a policy debate anymore. This was about something deeper, the soul of the nation, the belief that every citizen deserves equality under the law, that no person should be treated as less than another simply because of their background, their race, or their status. What we witnessed today, Harris continued, was not a clash of ideologies, but a clash of values. We saw a policy that sought to divide us, to pit one group of people against another. We saw a policy that disregarded the very principles that make this country great, fairness, equality, and the belief that everyone, regardless of their background, deserves a chance to thrive. Her voice was unwavering as she spoke, her words resonating with the clarity of truth. But we also saw something else. We saw the strength of the people. We saw the strength of the law. And we saw the power of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The camera zoomed in on her face as she looked directly into the lens, speaking not just to the gathered reporters, but to the millions watching across the country. This is what leadership looks like, she said, her eyes shining with the conviction that had carried her through the battle. Leadership is not about power. It's not about pushing an agenda or scoring political points. Leadership is about standing up for justice when it's hard. Leadership is about standing up for the truth, even when it means taking on the most powerful forces in this country. Leadership is about making sure that everyone, every person, every family, has the opportunity to live with dignity. Her words were a call to action. A rallying cry to those who had fought for justice for so long and felt their voices stifled. A reminder that the fight was far from over, but that it was worth fighting. That the laws of the land, no matter how often they were twisted or ignored, still had the power to protect the people. Make no mistake, Harris continued, her gaze unwavering, this is not just a political battle. This is a fight for the soul of America. It's a fight to determine what kind of country we will be. Will we be a country that stands for justice and equality, or will we be a country that turns its back on its most vulnerable, its most marginalized? That's the choice we face today. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. The camera clicked away, capturing the resolve in her eyes. I choose justice, she said simply. I choose a country where the law protects the rights of all people, not just the powerful. And I choose a future where every American, no matter their background, their race, or their status, can live with dignity, knowing that the law is on their side. In that moment, Harris had not just delivered a victory over McConnell. She had delivered a message to the nation, a message that would resonate long after the debate had ended. It was a message of hope, of moral clarity, of the belief that reason, justice, and the rule of law would always overcome corruption, arrogance, and hubris. And as she walked away from the podium, the impact of her words rippled outward. The nation was listening. And the battle for justice was far from over. But now, more than ever, it felt like it could be won. Kamala Harris didn't just win a debate today, she won a victory for every person who believes in justice, fairness, and the power of the law. She proved that when we stand together and fight for what's right, we can take on even the most entrenched forces of power and make real change. This wasn't just about defeating one policy, it was about proving that the rule of law is a shield for the people, not a tool for the powerful. But this fight doesn't end here. The truth is, there are many more battles to be fought, and we all have a part to play. What Harris did today is a reminder that our voices matter, that we have the power to stand up for those who have been silenced and forgotten. Now, it's up to us to carry that fight forward. So, what will you do to make your voice heard? What will you do to be a part of this movement for justice? Whether it's through sharing this video, engaging in the conversation, or standing up for what's right in your own community, now is the time to take action. If you believe in the power of justice, the power of the law, and the power of the people, then join us. Subscribe, share this video with those who need to hear it, and be part of a movement that's bigger than politics. It's about ensuring that America lives up to its true values. Let's keep this fight going. Together, we can make a difference.